Okay, so this is notes for today, Tuesday, April 30th, and we are picking up with the USS Cole bombings. So we got to do these various acts of terrorism yesterday. We talked about World Trade Center bombing being Middle Eastern Islamic base. Oklahoma City bombing was a guy who wanted to start this revolution against the federal government. Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, was this guy who, again, was kind of wacko, living off in the woods and mailing bombs to people, but also wanted to kind of target the government. And the last one, the USS Cole, is another Islamic Middle Eastern based terrorist attack. These guys, it's only a year out from 9/11, and these guys are attached to like Al-Qaeda and the people who eventually will bomb the Twin Towers the next year. But the USS Cole is a Navy ship that was off the coast of Yemen. And when it was on patrol, there's always a lot of fisher boats around these guys. Well, a fisher boat pulled up alongside the USS Cole and was a suicide boat essentially, and it was filled with bombs. So the bomb goes off, and you maybe can see here on the video here the picture of the ship. It has a hole in the side of it. It kills like 17 sailors on board, injures many more than that. But the ship does not sink. The way that the ships are built, they can shut off certain parts of the ship and keep it, watertight, keep it afloat. So the ship does not sink or anything, but it obviously has to go through under major repairs. So it's going to get hauled off to get repaired, but it's another example of a terrorist attack. In this case, Islamic Middle Eastern base with the extremist groups. So we saw kind of the road where it was heading towards 9/11, where you saw some of these attacks happening in the 90s leading towards 9/11. Okay, so we're going to finish up Clinton and talking about a change in American society. Not really Clinton-based, but just kind of what's happening in America at the turn of the century. So in the 90s, the fastest growing regions of the U.S. continue to be the West and the South. That's something you want to be aware of, and that I have seen as a question. After World War II, from about the 50s onward, even to now, the fastest growing regions of the country are the West and the South. So you might see a question about that, where more people are filling into those areas, which means more political representation and obviously more influence for those areas. Places like California, Texas, Florida, the states with the big populations. The South was the most populous with over 100 million people. The South becomes the most populous with over 100 million people. And the West enjoyed the shift in congressional representation and electoral votes. Like California has like 55 now. And all the three West Coast states, Oregon, Washington, and California, all fairly large, have a lot of representation out there. So these areas become more influential for political power. And in 2000, 80% of Americans live in about 280 metro areas. So around 2000, about 80% of Americans live around 280 metro areas. Meaning that we've continued this shift away from rural areas, right? That since the start of this country, we mostly rural, agricultural. Then by the 1920s, we shift we're more urban. And so by the 2000, 80% of people live in or around a metro area, including yourself, right? You live in Zachary, which is considered a suburb of Baton Rouge, and you're not living, Zachary's not a rural area. No matter what you think, it's not a rural area, right? White only decline as a percentage. So whites being a more dominant race in the country are going to decline. It was about 87% in the 70s. It's down to about 75% by 2000. This is mostly thanks to lower birth rates of just mostly white people, as well as shift in immigration origins. For the longest time, most immigration came from where? Europe, right? And after World War II, a lot of that immigration now comes from Asia as well as Latin America. And so as a result, you don't see as many just generic white people, which means that the population of whites are also declining too. African Americans hit 12% of the population by 2000, but who surpasses them as the biggest minority? Latinos, Hispanics, right? So in 2000, Hispanics become the largest minority with over 13%, and they're only climbed since then. So in 2000, they were 13% of the population, but but they now have gotten larger and larger, especially with immigration from Latin American areas. Asians have about 10 million Asian Americans living here around 2000, and they keep growing as well. Immigration accounts for about 28% of the increase in population in the 90s. So immigration is still very key. Even though we have some restrictions on it, immigration is still very much key to our population growth, especially in the 90s. They're also a key to to our economic growth because they serve as a labor force. So they're also key to our economic growth because they also become part of our labor force. Whether they're, working and getting paid high quality jobs or not, they're still, even if they're taking these jobs on that we don't want or typically don't take, they're still a very vital part of our society. By 2000, there's more concern for people who are older, 65 and older, for things like health care and drugs and senior housing and Social Security. So by 2000, there's a lot more concern for people who are 65 and older for things like health care, drugs, senior housing, Social Security. Why do you think that is? Why all of a sudden there's a lot of interest in older people?
Because the baby boomers?
Because those damn baby boomers are getting older and starting to get closer to retirement age, right? So now all of a sudden, we got to care about old people, right? Because a lot of them, right? So there's also a decline in traditional marriage. There's also a decline in traditional marriage and the rise of single parent families. So you are seeing kind of a breakdown of traditional marriage over time. A lot more single parents, whether it's intentional or not. That starts back in the 70s and 80s. In 1970, you had the female as solo head of the household around 10% of the population, and now by 2000, it's about 18%. So you have female solo heads of the family around 10% in 1970, to where it's now 18% by 2000. And with African American families, it's even higher, with a 47% rate. So for African American families, it's even higher with a 47% rate as well. Which, unfortunately, with more single-parent families, you see a higher increase of what then? Or a higher level of what in these families? So one-parent family. What? Poverty, right? So also, statistically, if you have a single parent, usually you also see a higher rate of poverty as well. Which means these children are growing up also in poverty-like conditions as well, too. The United States also entered 2000 as the richest country in the world, but with the largest gap between lowest and highest paid workers. So America entered the 2000 as the richest country in the world, but with the largest gap between lowest and highest paid workers. Yay, capitalism! Woo-hoo. And obviously a lot of the wealth is on the end of the spectrum towards the wealthy. So the upper classes possess most of the wealth. Now, whether you think it's a good or bad thing is up to you. But obviously, there's a lot of people in government who believe that the ideas of less government involvement, stronger businesses, stronger upper class means a stronger economy overall. You could also argue there should be a higher minimum wage, whatever there's all kinds of different things you can talk about here. But the top 20% saw their income increase since the 1970s, while groups below that all saw mostly declining income. And I don't mean like they weren't making more money over time. I mean like with inflation, right? With inflation over time, people in the top 20% are making more money, are actually getting more wealth, whereas people might be making more money if you're in the bottom 80%, but is the growth of your money keeping up with inflation essentially? No. Like whenever I was in high school, in 2003, 04 era, minimum wage was $5.15, right? And now it's only still $7.25, right? It's about 15 years later. And so, I'm not saying it's dramatically different, but, it's $5.15 held more buying power back in 2003 and 04, whereas now it's not as great. But even then, to only have it go up basically $2 in that time period is not necessarily that much. And so, statistically, minimum wage could be a lot higher than it probably should be right now. But there's a lot of arguments for and against it. But the point is that, just regular people's buying power, is not necessarily increased, although the wealthy has. As far as race goes, on average, whites made around $53,000 in 2000. So whites made around $53,000 on average. Latinos made about $35,000, and African Americans made about $34,000. So as far as based on race, whites around 2000 make around $53,000, Latinos make around $35,000, and African Americans make around $34,000.
Is this within the labor code?
Right. So these are all some statistics and some things that are changing turn the century to be aware of for around 2000. But does anybody have any questions about any of this? Bill Clinton or anything else related? Okay. We're going to transition into the next president. Who's going to be? George W. Bush, right? Bush Jr., Bush the Younger, right? Okay, so talking about the 2000 election. This is one of the closest elections we've seen in U.S. history. It becomes between the vice president, Al Gore, under Bill Clinton, and George W. Bush. So George W. Bush was the governor of Texas at the time. So you have governor of Texas for the Republicans, and you have the vice president under Bill Clinton, Al Gore, who run against each other. Foreign policy was not that big of an issue in this election, although it will be within a year with 9/11. Bless you. Most of the things they focused on was domestic policy related. So what this election all comes down to is Florida. So the election results come out that Tuesday. I remember this happening because I remember staying up very late at night to see who'd win. And I gave up around 1 a.m. and woke up the next day and there still wasn't a president. So it came down to where neither guy won enough electoral votes on Tuesday to win. Gore was the closest. I think Gore had 260-something and Bush was 250-something. But Florida's electoral votes were too close, or their popular vote was too close to call to give one guy the vote over the other. So they had to get Florida to win. Every other state was decided by Tuesday night except for Florida. And if you watch the news that night of the election, at one point news broadcasters called it Florida for Gore. Then they retracted that and said, no, it's too close to call. Then they gave it to Bush. Then they retracted that. So they kept going back and forth, and they never really got a decisive answer. So basically, because their votes were, the margin was so small, it had to force a recount. So according to Florida's laws, Bush was leading in Florida, but the vote margin was so small they had to force a recount. So they officially did a recount. And a few days after the election, they go through and they count. They go through by machine and recount all the states. Not all the counties in Florida. And it comes out to where Bush is still ahead, but his margin of victory is much smaller now. It's within only a couple 100,000 votes. Very, very small. And so the Gore team felt like there were some areas of Florida that didn't look right in terms of vote count. Some areas that are usually very Democratic didn't come out that way. So the Gore team requested individual recounts. So even though the state of Florida basically said this is the official outcome of the election, and the Gore team requested this recount of certain counties, then the Bush team, and essentially they sued to have this recount stop, saying you can't do these individual counts here in these different counties and so forth. So there's going to be a lawsuit involved, which is going to be Bush v. Gore. So Bush v. Gore goes to the Supreme Court, and basically you're going to go a month without having decided who the president is. The Supreme Court, it's going to come down to them. These 9 people who are unelected are going to decide the outcome of the election. So it goes to the Supreme Court, and essentially in the Bush v. Gore Supreme Court case, they rule that you can't have this individual count of the election. The state already certified it, so on and so forth. So in a 5-4 decision, which was even more controversial, was basically they thought it was on party lines. In a 5-4 decision, they said the recounts had to stop, which basically means who wins the election? Bush does, right? So Bush wins the election as a result of this. Very controversial. Al Gore had won the popular vote, but he's going to win the electoral vote. So he gets Florida and secures the presidency as a result of that election. What also hurt Gore, too, is that there was a very popular third-party candidate running, Ralph Nader, a guy we actually talked about a while back who wrote Unsafe at Any Speed back in the 1960s. He runs as the Green Party candidate in 2000, and a lot of folks think because he pulled votes away from Gore that it might have cost Gore the election as well, too. Essentially, the court case said that the recount violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, so it had to stop. So Bush becomes president as a result, and he goes on. He'll win his re-election in 2004, this time outright with the popular vote and electoral vote. But this election was obviously controversial, just kind of like 2016 was as well, too. Okay, political polarization. Early 21st century elections revealed a very big divide between the conservative South and West and more liberal Northeast and East and West Coast. So the 21st century elections, and we're still in the middle of this as you probably can figure out, reveal that you have a divide between the very conservative South and Western parts of the country versus the more liberal Northeast and Eastern and Western coast parts of the country. Traditionalist, religious people, and nationalist rural areas in small towns usually vote Republican. So traditionalists, religious people, nationalist rural areas, meaning people who are like gung-ho America, and small towns typically vote Republican. More diverse, tolerant, and international-minded urban areas usually vote Democrat. So that's usually kind of the big voter bases currently, as we've seen in the 2000s since the start of the century. So more diverse, tolerant, international-minded urban areas usually vote Democrat. The shift of Southern white conservatives in the 60s, and we mentioned this a while back, from Democrat to Republican transformed U.S. politics as well, too. Because along this time, Democrats are very dominant. Now it's because they relied on the solid South, right? The Republicans shift to be the South shifts to be more Republican because the Republican Party becomes this party of being conservative. And so it helps to better balance out the country, so to speak, and helps to shift politics in the country as a result. In the 90s, conservative Southern Republicans took over Congress. That's why they took over Congress, right? Because a lot of people who vote for Republicans are now voting out of where? The South. Who had traditionally voted what for a very long time? Democrats, right? Which is why the Democrats controlled Congress for such a long time. But now, around the 80s and 90s, more Southerners are voting Republican, which is why Republicans now have more presence in national politics, especially Congress. It also made it more partisan in Congress. And so a lot of moderate Republicans lost influence because the South has always been conservative. That means the Republicans they put in office are more conservative, which means the more moderate Republicans, who are more typical of the party, back in the first half of the century, they are losing influence. All right. Domestic policies. So Bush pushed the tax cuts, deregulation, federal aid to faith-based organizations. So Bush pushes tax cuts, deregulation, federal aid to faith-based organizations. So Bush pushed tax cuts, deregulation, federal aid to faith-based organizations, pro-life legislation, meaning anti-abortion. So pro-life legislation, school choice, and we're still doing school choice even now, Social Security and Medicare privatization. Social Security, Medicare privatization. Drilling for oil in Alaska. Drilling for oil in Alaska. And voluntary environmental industry standards. Voluntary environmental industry standards. So that kind of goes with deregulation, right? Make where you have less government oversight for environmental concerns. So I'll give it to you all one more time. So Bush pushes for tax cuts, deregulation, federal aid to faith-based organizations,
pro-life legislation, school choice, Social Security, Medicare privatization, drilling for oil in Alaska, and voluntary environmental industrial standards. Now, all this were the things that he was pushing from the get-go before what? 9/11 and the War on Terror, right? Because that's going to change everything too. Now, he's still going to push for all these things in his administration, but that's where he thought his focus would be, not on foreign policy, which is where it's going to end up being. And that's one big idea that Republicans have then and now is privatization of Social Security and Medicare. As we said, right now, whenever you pay out of your paycheck for Social Security and Medicare, where's it going? Into the giant pot, right? It means you're basically paying for people using it right now, right? So the idea that they basically have is that stop doing that and just pay into your own private account. So whatever money you take out is what? Your own money, right? And that was an idea they had. It isn't passed, it doesn't happen, but that's still an idea floating around even now. As a way to make that more stable, that whole program, because obviously, if you've been following the news, those programs are losing money more and more every year. Again, because who? Baby, right? All right, so one of the things that Bush does accomplish early on in his administration are tax cuts. Well, that's going to help in the late 90s we talked about. Not recession. The budget surplus and all the success with the balanced budget and so forth. So Congress passed the $1.35 trillion tax cut in 2001 for 10 years. So Congress passed a $1.35 trillion tax cut in 2001 for 10 years. So we talked about how the top tax bracket, that tax get a bit more under Clinton. So all that's going to come back down again. So under Bush, you're going to get a lower top tax bracket. So you're going to get a lower top tax bracket. So increase child tax credits. Just good. You have children, get tax credits. So the story is have more kids, get more tax rates, right? Increase child tax credits. Eliminate estate taxes. It's eliminated estate taxes. And it gave all taxpayers a rebate. It gave all taxpayers at all levels more of a rebate on their taxes. The tax cuts were so successful, there will be another series of tax cuts in 2003. So in 2001 and 2003, the Republican Congress and the Republican President passed through a series of tax cuts. And it goes back to the same thing on Reagan. You do a bunch of tax cuts, it just makes the economy what? Up and increase, right? Of course, there are other goals also to help reduce social spending, but will all that happen? And what makes us go into a bunch of deficit spending in the 2000s is because you're also going to add on spending on what as well? War on terror, right? So like this tax cut, the first one passed before War on Terror starts. So it wouldn't have been bad, but had the War on Terror in, and now you see a lot of spending, military spending, with Iraq and Afghanistan and so forth. The tax cuts help everybody, but it's going to greatly add to national debt in the 2000s and to today. So, back when Bush was in office, you only had a few $1 trillion in debt. Whenever he leaves office, it's like around $10 trillion, and then Obama leaves around like $19 trillion, and it just says keep going. It's up and up right now. Right now with Trump at 22, right? So it's just going up and up and up. That was one of the things Obama talked about getting rid of was the tax cuts from Bush. Because they were so popular, it actually doesn't. So like that was the things that he talked about getting rid of, but actually keeps them around after he becomes president. Okay, reform. So he also, this is Bush, also passes a bipartisan measure called No Child Behind. So also passes a bipartisan measure called No Child Left Behind, which is aimed at improving student performance. We don't have officially anymore, but we have a lot of the effects of No Child Behind. One of the biggest things that No Child Left Behind is that it increases assessments of schools, verify that children are doing well and that you're doing well. So it's like schools are now doing a lot more way to assess. Standard testing, which hey, that's tomorrow, English, and next week with us. So states now going to do a lot more standard testing as a result of No Child Left Behind to assess how schools do. It was also to try to help improve that gap between well-to-do and poor districts. It was trying to help improve the gap between well-to-do and the poor districts in public schools. So this provides a lot of nationwide testing, as we said. It will help improve literacy rates. It will help improve literacy rates. It also requires that teachers be highly qualified or highly trained, basically meaning that at one point in schools you could have teachers come in with maybe just a bachelor's degree, maybe not even with a full college degree and be a teacher. Now you have to have them, everybody be qualified. In public schools, private schools, whatever they want, but for schools you have to have people with a degree and with a license, which makes us highly certified. This also allows for kids who are to fail schools to transfer easier to better schools. Because like the way that most school districts work is that wherever you live, you go, right? Wherever school you live nearby, that's what you go to. So this makes it to where a lot of states have programs. If you are in a failing school district, you might be easier to get out of and go to a better school district somewhere else nearby. So no child left behind. Republicans also reformed Medicare to allow seniors to enroll in private insurance they chose. Republicans also reformed Medicare to allow seniors to enroll in private insurance if they so chose to do so. Alright, lastly, economy. So the tech and internet we talked about in our bill peaked around 2000, ended by there was a bit of a small stock market crash that happened in 2001 and a recession. So with the tech and internet crash 2001, going to have a recession. Unemployment hit 6%. Like I saw, those people invested in the internet bubble now in better instead. They fell stable. This was also a time where a lot of businesses were found to be fraud. Also a time there's several large businesses found to be fraud the market. Two biggest ones were Enron and WorldCom. So Enron and WorldCom were basically called cooks, where they were not making much profits. They were telling their investors, and they were working to their investors, and their people ran the company all essentially. So yeah, so a lot of these investors who made money into internet and other investment companies for a while move their money to real estate because they feel like it's longer and stable, but that's going to cause a housing bubble to be created around. Alright, any questions on early stuff, Bush? Alright, something is going to make most of Bush administration foreign terror. Sorry about that. So let's get a little background here about the terrorism, where it all starts, and how we get to 9/11 forth. So Bush surrounded himself with Republican foreign policy in his cabinet, while Secretary Colin Powell, who was a general, his President Cheney, had Secretary of Defense, and a lot of foreign policy experience too. So he had a lot of confidence, very aggressive approach against terror, which won over Americans. So early on, Bush's confident and aggressive approach against terror won over many Americans, but it also alienated us towards limits. Because we took a very kind of solo, aggressive approach, do it our way or the highway, it all kind of alienated other nations, Europe and other places. Alright, so the roots of terrorism. So, there was a lot of senators who were upset with the going back in the 40s whenever we recognized Israel's creation. Israel back in 1948 after World War II because of the war. The what? The Holocaust. Right? So it was over the area also Palestine, which is Palestinians who live in that same area. But this created was Israel. At first created a shared state, but the Middle East didn't like that, to war several times. And every time they went to war, Israel won. And so these ended up with a lot of territory around what is now essentially between 1946. Well, one that forms the 60s that tries to pack Israelis to get rid of the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation. So the PLO formed in the 60s with the mission to destroy it, to take rid of Israel, to Palestine instead. So the PLO does a terrorist activity, a lot of surprise random attacks. We've a few times. So Middle Eastern countries on Israel see this to be power. So there's off again wars with countries around Israel. And Israel's allies since America. We supply them with weapons, we supply them with supplies and help. So obviously because of all this, countries around Israel don't gust for it. Then you get to 1990, you get to the Gulf War. We heavy presence in the Persian Gulf War in the early 80s. A lot of Islamic extremists don't like extended present 90s. So a lot is going to become Al-Qaeda. Always got in the full these groups in the 90s, and they pre-hot against us. Preach a jihad against them, a holy war against us, where they want to attack all Christians and Jews. They want Israel, but they all want to get rid of America in 4 areas. So jihad mentality some of these extremist Middle East have leads to the 93 World Trade Center. There was also bombings on embassies in the 90s in Tanzania. There was also bombings in Tanzania, U.S. Embassy, and the USA back in 2000. They want us there, they want us having us there, they want us there. That's the overlay of why they want up the area. Al-Qaeda or in one living in Afghanistan, their governmental Taliban. So the Taliban is this pro-extremist, fundamental Islam that has been running Afghanistan for a while. Part of all, they're not into Al-Qaeda, part of they're basically should protect them. How to operate Afghanistan in protection. September 11th. So September 2001's morning, we have 4 hijacked Eastern, 20 Eastern operatives over here for the past several months. They've been getting planes about how to planes are very big. They hijacked 4 planes in the morning with boxes and things. They weren't really bombs, but looks. And the first planes hit ours immediately, so they warped out. So that hits the south tower. And then on the plane crashed in you see. The plane was, the passengers all tried to take it. But the terror crashed in the field in Pennsylvania. And as a footage of this scene, after the 2 hit, it took about a half to 2 attacks. Many of the people walked before her. A lot of workers got forced by the building down. 930,000 people. From all 4 nights, about 3 get killed. Including a lot of the rescue work. attacks galvanized opinion power the Bush nation to the entire story and the Bushman action. So, this is directly the war in what country? Right now. Afghanistan. We are Afghanistan. We're in Afghanistan, right? So, October 2000, we're going to attack terrorists in Afghanistan, which starts to happen. The Taliban for Al-Qaeda government goes there it's us, other cores, so Americans and other forces. We quickly in the next several years, we're moving out of office. All fighting for a while, but going to hiding. We won't until 20. But we're going to continue to stabilize the terrorists in Afghanistan result. And this one door, like Bush had like approval rate 8%. The office was one of the lowest, it was like 21 or 20 people. You know, Bush told his administration. So, in several months, the majority of the Al-Qaeda legion, we don't get rid of it because a lot of senior from other areas as well. But help stabilize the country. And it's up when you're gonna have a democracy force. So the instance of a government, which is that's all by up. The army wants you to go in here, wants you to go to Seattle, something like that. Freedom system in Afghanistan. And once the problem with Afghanistan, we really want to facilities popping up. And so it's like, we don't want to, because we feel like right back to us. We're trying to remain as right? So we will maintain ability, but have to fight Albania. We out of control, so it's just difficult in general. So after 9/11, most were now willing to back on airports such as going to give up privacy and life first, like it's protects. The greatest example of that Patriot. So you had no 1 3, you had the asshole guys. The federal government awarding balance on people. Bills, messages, funds. All that alone. So like, we're right. So also, right. There's a lot more Spanish to the nation. The government will arrest all the time. And there's all things get worse that these fellas are gonna get out of. First 7 years after 11, they were welcome out there to help study future us. We'll never know these ever actually off the terrorists in Iraq, but it could have happened. We still know. Now you can have